I check things for a living. That's the whole job, really, stripped down to its bones. Companies send us their emissions reports, their discharge logs, their little spreadsheets full of numbers that are supposed to tell the truth about what they're putting into the air and the water. My job is to look at those numbers and ask, quietly, is this real? My name is Rochelle, and I was good at asking that question. I'm saying this plainly and honestly because later a lot of people in that office tried to make it sound like a character flaw. It wasn't. Being good at your job is not a character flaw, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'd been at the department 3 years when this started. Environmental compliance, 3rd floor, government building, fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look a little bit ill. I liked it there. I liked the quiet click of people entering data, the smell of the break room coffee that nobody would admit to making badly, the particular satisfaction of finding a discrepancy in a report, and knowing you were the only thing standing between a company's convenient story and the actual truth. Tanya had been there longer. She was a supervisor, same level as me on paper, though everyone understood she carried more weight than that. She had a way of tilting her head when she disagreed with you, a small pause before she spoke, like she was giving you one last chance to reconsider before she corrected you. People deferred to her. I didn't think much of it at first. Offices have their hierarchies, written and unwritten, and I figured I'd learn where the unwritten ones were soon enough. I learned faster than I expected. It started with the Richards Company filing, a mid-size manufacturing plant. Nothing dramatic, just a report where 3 numbers didn't add up the way they should have. I flagged it the way I flagged anything, wrote up the discrepancy, sent it up the chain, simple, routine. The kind of thing I did 4 or 5 times a month without anyone blinking. Tanya blinked. She came to my desk 2 days later, coffee in hand, and sat on the edge of it like we were old friends catching up. You flagged the Reyes numbers. I did. The runoff figures don't match the intake logs. She nodded slowly, like she was considering something much larger than 3 mismatched numbers. You sure about that? Because once that goes upstream, it's not just Reyes that looks bad. It's us. It's the department's compliance rate for the quarter. I remember looking at her for a second too long, trying to understand what she meant. That's the point, though. If they're out of compliance, we're supposed to catch it. Sure, she said. Sure. I'm just saying, think about how it reads. High non-compliance numbers make it look like we're not doing our jobs out here. I thought high non-compliance numbers meant we were doing our jobs, finding the ones that aren't following the rules. She smiled at that, but it didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. You're new. You'll get a feel for how this works. I didn't get a feel for it. I got worse at pretending I did. That was the beginning of what I'd later think of as the quiet math, the version of compliance where a low number of violations was treated as the win condition instead of an accurate count of who was following the rules. It was a philosophy, and it was hers, and it ran the whole department whether anyone said so out loud or not. I kept flagging things, not because I was trying to make a point, because the numbers didn't add up and it was my job to say so. A trucking company with discharge logs that read suspiciously identical for 6 months straight. A processing plant whose air quality numbers were always exactly at the legal threshold and never a hair over or under, which is its own kind of tell. I wrote them up. I sent them up. And every time Tanya's compliance rate for her floor ticked a little lower, and every time something in her face went a little tighter. She never yelled because it would almost be easier if she had. Yelling is a single ugly moment you can point to. What Tanya did was slower than that, and quieter, and much harder to describe to anyone who wasn't standing close enough to feel it. It started with her own team. I noticed it first as an absence. People who used to loop me in on cross-checks stopped looping me in. Data I needed for corroboration started arriving a day late, then 2 days late, then not at all until I asked 3 times. I asked Pam, who'd always been friendly, why the intake logs I needed for a joint case hadn't come through. She looked at her keyboard instead of at me. I got pulled onto something else. Sorry. Pulled onto what? Just busy. Sorry, Rochelle. I let it go. Everyone's busy. That's a normal sentence in a normal office. But it kept happening, and it stopped being just her team. Within 2 months, people from a completely separate unit, people I barely worked with, people whose deadlines had nothing to do with mine, started giving me the same careful, apologetic distance. It was a strange thing to watch spread, almost geological in how slow and total it was. First, it was just the awkward pause before someone answered an email. Then it was emails that didn't get answered at all until I followed up twice. Then it was hallway conversations that ended a beat too quickly when I walked up, people suddenly remembering somewhere else they needed to be. Meetings I used to get invited to for context. Nothing critical, just the kind of standing invite you get when you're someone people think to loop in, started happening without me. I'd only find out after the fact, from the minutes if I found out at all, and there was something particularly disorienting about that specific kind of exclusion. It's one thing to be told no, it's another to simply stop existing on a calendar, quietly, without anyone ever having to make the decision to your face. I started noticing the shape of it more than the substance. A shared drive folder I used to have automatic access to that now required a request. A CC line on an email chain that used to include me by default, trimmed down. My name just gone 1 week with no explanation. None of it was ever big enough on its own to complain about. That was the design of it, I think, whether or not Tanya had planned it that consciously. Each individual absence was small enough to be an accident, a scheduling oversight, an honest mistake. It was only in the accumulation that you could see it was something else entirely, the way a single missing brick means nothing. But a wall with 100 of them missing isn't a wall anymore. I remember doing the math on it late one night, trying to count backward through my calendar to the last time I'd been included in something without having to ask. It had been 6 weeks. I sat with that number for a long time before I let myself feel anything about it. I want to say I figured out the mechanism right away, but I didn't. It took a comment from Devin, one of the few people still willing to talk to me at lunch, muttered over a sandwich like it cost him something to say it. She told my supervisor that if people kept feeding you information for the escalations, it would reflect on their reviews. Whose reviews? Everyone's. She didn't say it to a room, she said it to people one at a time. It adds up. That was Tanya's whole method, I came to understand. Not a policy, not a memo anyone could point to and say, look, this is what she did. Just quiet, individual conversations, the kind that leave no trail, that plant a small cold fact in someone's head. Cooperate with Rochelle, and I will remember it when it's time to evaluate you. She never needed to make good on that threat very often. The threat did the work by itself. By month 4, I could count on one hand the people in that office who would still talk to me like a person instead of a liability. Devin. Pam, sometimes, when no one was looking. A data clerk named Marcus, who either hadn't gotten the message or didn't care. And that was it. Out of a floor of nearly 40 people. I want to tell you I handled it with total grace, that I floated above it, serene and untouched. I didn't. There were nights I sat in my car in the parking garage for 10 minutes before I could make myself drive home, replaying some small slight from the day, a meeting invite that hadn't come, a hello that hadn't been returned, trying to figure out what I'd actually done wrong. The answer, when I let myself sit with it, was always the same. Nothing. I'd done my job. That was the whole crime. But the job got harder without cooperation. That was the practical cost, underneath the personal one. Compliance work is not solitary work. It's built on people handing each other pieces of a puzzle, on cross-checks and corroboration, on someone in another unit pulling a file for you without making you fight for it. When that stopped, my caseload slowed, reports sat longer, and I started to understand, with a kind of cold clarity, that this wasn't just about making me feel bad, it was about making me worse at my job, so that eventually there'd be a paper reason to get rid of me that had nothing to do with the actual reason. I went to Victor. Victor was our director, a soft-spoken man who'd been in the job long enough to have forgotten most of what it originally required of him. He liked things calm. He liked his quarterly reports to look tidy, and his Fridays to end without incident. He had, over the years, come to rely on Tanya for almost everything. She told him what the floor needed, she told him what the numbers meant, she told him, essentially, what to think about his own department. I understand now that this wasn't laziness exactly, it was more like abdication. He'd found someone willing to carry the weight of actually running things, and he'd let her carry all of it, including the parts that should have stayed his. I wanted to talk about something happening on the floor, I said, sitting across from his desk, which had a small dying plant on it that no one ever watered. Of course! What's going on? I laid it out as evenly as I could. The isolation, the slow, deliberate freeze-out, the pattern of people telling me, in careful, apologetic words, that they'd been warned off cooperating with me. Victor listened with his hands folded, nodding at the right intervals, doing a very good impression of a man taking something seriously. When I finished, he said, "I'm sure it's not as deliberate as it feels. People get busy. Teams shift." Victor, I have 3 people telling me directly that they were told there'd be consequences for helping me. Did anyone say Tanya's name? I hesitated because the honest answer was implied, not stated, and I watched him catch that hesitation and relax into it like a life raft. Look, Rochelle, Tanya's been here a long time. She knows how to keep this floor running. I don't doubt something's off socially, but I can't go make accusations without more than a feeling. He gave me a smile that was meant to be reassuring and mostly wasn't. I'll keep an eye on it. He did not keep an eye on it. I understood, walking out of his office, that I would not be getting help from that direction. Victor was not going to protect me, not because he was cruel, but because protecting me would have cost him the comfortable arrangement he had with Tanya, and comfort was the only thing he was actually invested in. So I did the only thing that had ever worked for me in that building. I went back to the numbers. The day I stopped waiting to be believed was the day I decided to be undeniable instead. I didn't set out to catch Tanya specifically, because it would be a better story if I'd been running some quiet campaign of justice from day one, but that's not what happened. What happened was the Smith conglomerate case landed on my desk, and it happened to be big enough, 3 separate facilities, multiple permit types, that it required 2 teams working in parallel, mine and Tanya's. That was standard for a company that size. It wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what I found when I went to reconcile my findings with hers, the way protocol required before a joint filing went up the chain. Her team's numbers for the Western facility didn't match the raw data I'd pulled independently. Not by a small margin, by a lot. Emissions figures that should have shown 3 violations over the reporting period showed 0. I checked it twice. Then a third time, in the quiet, methodical way I checked everything, because I have learned that the worst thing you can do with a serious accusation is bring it forward before you're sure. I pulled the original source documents, not the summary her team had submitted, but the raw sensor logs from the facility itself, cross-referenced against the timestamps. The violations were there, in the raw data, plain as anything. They were simply absent from the version her team had filed upward. I sat with that for 2 full days before I did anything, not out of fear, though there was some of that, mostly because I wanted to be sure I understood exactly what I was looking at before I said a word to anyone. A discrepancy is not the same as an accusation. I needed to know which one this was. By the 3rd day, I knew. This wasn't a rounding error or a data entry mistake repeated 3 times across 3 different figures. This was a pattern, and patterns don't happen by accident. I documented everything, every source file, every timestamp, every place where the submitted numbers diverged from the raw logs, laid out clean and dated and impossible to misread. I made copies. I made copies of the copies, and then I went to Victor, not with a feeling this time, but with a folder an inch thick. "I need you to look at something," I said, and set it on his desk. "Before I file the joint report, because there's a serious discrepancy between what I pulled from the source data and what Tanya's team submitted." He opened the folder like it might be something that could still be talked away. It wasn't. I watched him go quiet somewhere around the 3rd page, the parts where the raw sensor timestamps sat right next to the falsified summary figures, side by side with no room left for a generous interpretation. "This is—" He didn't finish the sentence. "It's not a mistake, Victor. It's the same kind of adjustment 3 separate times on 3 separate reporting periods. That's not how mistakes work." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see something moving behind his eyes that I recognized, the particular discomfort of a man realizing that the easy path he'd been walking for years had just run out from under him. "I have to bring this to her," he said finally. "She'll want to respond to it." "That's fine. The data doesn't change depending on who responds to it." He brought it to her. I don't know exactly what was said in that room, and honestly, I've stopped needing to know. What I do know is what happened after. Tanya's team, the same team that had spent months keeping quiet distance from me on her instruction, suddenly came alive with urgency, filing complaints about my conduct, my tone, my supposed pattern of targeting her work specifically. It happened fast, faster than anything organic ever happens in a government office. Complaints about workplace conduct usually trickle in. Someone mentions something to HR. HR mentions it to a supervisor. Weeks pass before anything's official. This wasn't that. This was 5 separate people submitting formal write-ups within the same 48 hours, using language that echoed each other in ways that felt too precise to be coincidence. Aggressive tone in meetings, pattern of undermining colleagues' work, creating a hostile environment. Different names at the bottom of each one, same handful of phrases running through all of them, like everyone had been handed the same 3 talking points and told to rotate through them in whatever order felt most natural. You know, kind of like the Republican Party. I recognized it for what it was almost immediately because I'd spent months learning to recognize Tanya's fingerprints on things she never touched directly. This was the freeze-out's louder cousin. Not silence this time, but noise. Coordinated noise, timed to arrive exactly when it could do the most damage. She couldn't argue with the sensor data. The timestamps didn't care about her tone of voice. So instead, she went after the only thing left that was still soft enough to attack: me, my conduct, my character. Make the conversation about whether I was difficult to work with, and maybe no one would get around to asking why 3 reporting periods of violations had quietly become 0. For about a day, it worked exactly the way she needed it to. Victor's office got quiet in a different way, not the empty quiet of before, but a busy, anxious quiet, doors opening and closing, HR pulled in, my name mentioned in rooms I wasn't in. I sat at my desk that day feeling something close to vertigo, watching a floor full of people I'd barely spoken to in months suddenly produce a unified account of a person I didn't recognize as myself. But complaints, even 5 of them arriving in perfect synchronization, are still just words about a feeling. They don't have timestamps. They don't have raw sensor logs sitting quietly underneath them, waiting to be checked. And that, in the end, was the miscalculation. Tanya had spent months learning exactly how to move people. She'd never quite learned that numbers don't move at all. I want to tell you that part scared me. It did, for about a day. There's a particular kind of vertigo that comes from watching an entire floor of people, many of whom you've never had a cross word with, suddenly produce complaints against you in near unison. It's disorienting in a way that's hard to explain unless you've lived it. For a moment I understood exactly how easy it would be for this to work, for the volume of complaints to simply outweigh the quiet, careful folder of evidence sitting on Victor's desk. But data doesn't respond to volume. That's the thing about numbers. You can get 40 people to write 40 complaints about someone's tone, and none of it changes what a censor recorded on a Tuesday in March. The day I stopped needing everyone to like me was the day their opinion stopped being able to move the facts. It took 3 weeks. Compliance investigations always take longer than you want them to, longer than feels bearable when you're the one at the center of it, walking through a building full of people who've been told your name is a problem. But 3 weeks isn't actually that long in the scheme of things, and at the end of it, the outcome was about as clean as these things ever get. An internal review confirmed the discrepancies were deliberate, tied specifically to Tanya's directives to her team, and she was terminated. I didn't hear it from Victor directly. I heard it the way you hear most real news in an office, from the shift in the air before anyone says a word. Doors that had been closed all week stayed open. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when I walked by, not out of malice this time, but out of something closer to embarrassment. Then the apologies started. They came one at a time, the same way the freeze-out had, which felt fitting in a way I didn't expect. Pam first, catching me by the break room, talking fast like she needed to get the words out before she lost her nerve. "I should have kept sending you the intake logs. I knew what she was doing and I let it slide because I didn't want the write-up." "I understand why," I said, and I meant it, mostly. I did understand. Fear is a real thing, and rent is a real thing, and I've never been in a position to say for certain what I would have done in someone else's exact shoes. Devin didn't apologize because he'd never needed to. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder once, wordlessly, which was its own kind of statement. And then there were the others, the ones I'd barely spoken to in months, who caught me in hallways with careful, rehearsed little speeches about how they hadn't meant anything by it, how they'd just been trying to keep their heads down, how they hoped there were no hard feelings. I told most of them the same thing, some version of, "I get it. I'm not angry." And that was true. I wasn't angry, not anymore, not by the time it was over. Anger takes a kind of energy I didn't have left to spend on people who'd mostly been afraid, not cruel. But I noticed something else sitting underneath the relief, something I hadn't expected. The apologies didn't put anything back the way it had been. I don't mean that dramatically, I mean it very plainly, the way you describe a fact about a bent piece of metal. You can straighten it mostly. It rarely goes back to being exactly what it was before it bent. The trust that had existed before, the easy, unthinking kind, where you hand someone a file because of course you do, because that's just what colleagues do for each other. That particular trust didn't come back with the apologies. What came back instead was something more careful. People were kind to me now, genuinely, I think. They pulled files quickly when I asked. They included me in the meetings again. But there was a new, quiet awareness underneath all of it, an understanding, unspoken but present, that if the wind ever shifted again, most of them would probably do the same thing twice. I don't say that with bitterness. I think it might just be what's true about most workplaces, most people, most rooms full of colleagues who are, underneath the job titles, just people trying to keep their jobs and their peace. I don't think that makes them villains. I think it makes them human, in the exact ordinary way that Tanya's cruelty had also somehow been human. The human instinct to protect your own position first, dressed up as loyalty to the department. Victor thanked me eventually in his careful, hands-folded way. "You handled that well," he said, like it had been a task assigned to me rather than something I'd survived. I didn't correct him. There wasn't a version of that conversation that would have made him understand what those months had actually cost, and I'd stopped needing him to. They gave Tanya's old position to someone new, an outside hire who didn't know the floor's history, and asked me in her first week why everyone seemed to check in with me before finalizing anything. I told her it was just habit. It wasn't, not exactly, but it was close enough to true, and some things don't need the whole explanation attached to them. I still work there. I still check the numbers, the same way I always have, because that part of me never changed through any of it. I was good at the job before Tanya decided that was a problem, and I was good at it after. The office is quieter now. In the ordinary way offices are quiet, not the specific hollow way it had been quiet for those months when almost no one would speak to me. Some evenings, walking to my car, I think about the folder, the one full of raw sensor data sitting beside the falsified summaries, page after page where the truth simply refused to align with the story someone wanted told about it. I think about how long I sat with that discrepancy before I brought it forward, making absolutely sure, because I understood by then exactly what it would cost me to be wrong, and exactly what it would take to be believed if I was right. What it cost me doesn't show up in any file. It's in the small flinch I still feel sometimes before I hand someone information I know they'll need. A half second of bracing, like some part of me is still waiting to be told no. It's in how carefully I document things now, even when no one's asked me to, because I remember exactly how it felt to have the truth and no one willing to hold it with me. Being right cost me something. It just wasn't anything I could point to on paper. I don't think I came out of those months the same person who went in. I came out more careful, with people, with trust, with how much of myself I let show in a room before I know it's safe. There's a version of me that existed before Tanya decided my honesty was a liability, a version who handed things over easily, who assumed good faith as a starting point instead of something to be earned back slowly. I miss her sometimes. I don't know that I'll get her back. I'm not sure I'd want to if getting her back meant forgetting what it took to survive without her. I don't think about it with triumph, particularly. It's not that kind of ending. I think about it the way you'd think about a scar that healed clean but still shows in certain light. Proof that something happened, proof that it's over, and proof, if I'm honest, that I'll never again assume a quiet office is necessarily a safe one. The numbers didn't lie. That was never really in question. The only real question, the whole time, was whether anyone would let them speak for themselves. Eventually someone did. It just took longer than it should have, and it cost more than it should have, and I've made my peace with both of those facts without pretending either one away. I've thought about leaving, more than once, more than I've said out loud to anyone, not because of Tanya, she's gone, and gone is gone, but because of Victor, who is still sitting in that office with his dying plant, still nodding at the right intervals, still waiting for someone else to do the parts of his job that require an actual spine. I understand something now that I didn't understand 3 years ago. A weak boss isn't a passive danger. He's an active one. He doesn't have to raise his voice or spread a single rumor. All he has to do is look away long enough and let someone louder decide what's true. I keep thinking about the fact that Tanya was the fire. Victor was the empty room that let that fire spread. I've learned that a weak boss will always tell you he's staying neutral. And neutral, in a room where someone is actively being harmed, is never actually neutral. It's a choice, just a quieter one. I haven't left. I think about it on the bad days. But I've stopped waiting for Victor to become someone else, and that, more than anything, is what finally let me exhale. I stayed in the end, but I stayed with my eyes open, which is a different thing than staying the way I used to. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe.